Hi friends, and welcome. We've got a bit of an Indian summer day here on our bend in the river, but we've already had our first snow. That's the way things are in the upper Midwest. You never know, and it's going to change. Still, today's adventure is a great one. We're going back to bow camp, and if you're a frequent flyer, well then you already know this year's bow camp is a whole lot different than in years past. The ladies have decided to give archery deer hunting a try, and they've kind of taken over bow camp. In fact, Kim Dewey has already harvested her first ever archery buck, so now Tina's going to give it a try. She's going to take her crossbow, head out to a ground blind, and try to get herself a deer before we have to pack up the big red truck and head it for South Dakota. We've only got a couple of days, but I'm fairly certain if the deer will cooperate, it's an archery hunt after all, we can get her a chance before we have to leave. Hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're going back to bow camp with the ladies right now. Tina and I got settled into a ground blind on the edge of a food plot where our trail camera had showed a number of fairly decent deer working. And after about an hour, there was a deer standing on the far side of the food plot back in the pines. It looked like a doe that had found herself a few acorns and she was just picking her way along. Tina was just kind of keeping an eye on her, and then she noticed a couple of more deer working their way out. It was still quite early in the afternoon, and the fact that there were deer already up and feeding was a good sign. Now all we needed was for one to be up and feeding a whole lot closer to Tina. And then one did. Kinda. This little guy worked his way right out in front of our blind. He was out there maybe 30-35 yards. And then he was joined by a couple more deer. No shooters yet, but the sun hadn't even set, and we already had 3 or 4 deer out in the food plot within 100 yards of us. This, friends, if you're on an archery hunt, is exactly what you hope to see. The deer fed out in the field for a little bit and then worked their way across, and were actually heading back into the timber. I whispered to Tina they're probably looking for the last of the acorns. There's quite a few big oaks on the other side of this food plot. And no sooner had they left when a couple of more deer started working their way out into the plot. The deer were definitely on the move, and they were moving early.
Bears are starting to move out into that food plot.
I whispered to T, they're certainly up and feeding.
There's another little buck. Little bitty buck.
We were watching this bachelor group of real young bucks working their way out when Tina leaned forward and then leaned back and whispered, "There's a tree back there that's growing a big antler." Out in the food plot behind Tina's left shoulder, there appeared to be a more mature buck working his way slowly in our direction. All we could really see from where we sat was just his antlers for quite a while. He was just feeding along, no real hurry, but if he kept coming in the direction he was currently pointing, from what I could see of his body, he appeared to be a mature deer, an 8 or maybe a 9 point. I was guessing 3 years old, maybe 4. Either way, he was certainly a shooter. And if he kept following the doe that was out in front of him feeding along, he would pass by fairly close. Now it was just a matter of would he turn right, would he turn left, or would he go straight ahead.
Why do I gotta know if that ain't gonna happen? Never know.
That's archery hunting. It's not a gun. You've got to get them in close enough to make a good shot. And sometimes the deer just choose to go the other way.
I'm not absolutely sure he's a shooter, but he's close.
The longer we looked at this deer, the better Tina liked him. He was definitely at least a 3-year-old, certainly a shooter, and he was already within 80 or 90 yards. All he needed to do now was come another 40 or 50 yards closer, and he'd be right in her wheelhouse. And then the doe he was feeding with turned and started walking back into the trees the same way some of the younger deer had gone earlier. There must be some oaks dropping some acorns or something, because she just meandered back in there, and yeah, he went right on after her.
He's gonna follow her. There he goes. He's just walking off toward the lake. Probably some acorns or something out there that they're getting at. He went the wrong way.
We could see him standing back there feeding. He didn't really go all that far, but he did look pretty content right where he was at.
Went the wrong way.
For a minute there, I thought we might actually get it done the very first evening. And I thought that right up until that buck walked off to eat acorns on the far side of the food plot. That's the way archery hunts are. If it's a rifle hunt, you see the deer, it's over. In an archery hunt, when you see the deer, it's just getting started. Still, we were in a good spot. I felt this was a good stand. We did see how much the deer were still favoring the acorns, so we decided that for the following evening, we'd go back to the stand we'd set up deep in the trees. There were a lot of oaks, 2 big groves of them, in fact, and we'd seen a lot of deer there earlier in the month. We decided we'd give it a try. Maybe that was the place Tina would get her chance. We headed out a little earlier than usual that next afternoon. Being set up this far back in the brush, you never know, and with the deer still cruising acorns, we might see a buck come by any time.
Okay. Tina, take 2. We got really close last time. Feeling lucky?
Little antsy.
Yeah. There's nothing to be nervous about. You got the world's greatest guide.
I can't do it all myself.
Oh. It's like you said the other day, of course, sometimes you talk to yourself, you need some expert advice, right?
Yeah.
What? There's nothing wrong with a girl having a little self-confidence. And besides that, this was a good area. There were a lot of oaks, and we'd seen a lot of deer here earlier. And about an hour later, a young buck was standing out at about 100 yards, munching on the acorns. The deer were up and moving, even though it was windy. Maybe this would be Tina's night. For now, though, all she could do was wait and watch. The wind was continuing to build. They were forecasting rain for later on this evening, but I was hopeful that a decent deer would get in here and present her with a chance before that happened. We were quietly watching this little bumpy spike right in front of us when Tina pointed out a bigger buck working his way in. This appeared to be a 7, maybe an 8 point. A 2-year-old deer, had kind of a funky right antler, a little twist and turn in it. Unfortunately, it is definitely too young to be a shooter. Still, it was a good sign. It wasn't raining, it was early, and we already had a decent buck right in front of us. We watched in silence as this buck fed at less than 30 yards for a good 10 minutes. I was kind of hoping he might drag something else in, something bigger, but he didn't. He just stood there feeding until all of a sudden he just stood up, looked around, and then walked off. It was almost as if he knew something was coming or something was going to happen, but for whatever reason, he just walked away. Within the next half hour, the wind speed had already doubled. The only deer we saw was this little guy all by himself. I don't know where his mom was, but he was much too young to be out wandering on his own. I did notice that not only had the wind really picked up, but it had already changed directions twice. It was obviously gonna storm. Now it was just a matter of how soon.
Sun's shining and it's raining. Welcome to Michigan in the fall. I don't you wish you were out in a tree? Yeah, this blind's pretty nice.
Mostly because Tina and I share the same aversion to shooting at deer during a rainstorm with archery equipment, we decided to hold off. I will admit, however, it was a lot nicer sitting in that ground blind than it would have been up in a tree stand getting soaked and freezing. Yeah, if it doesn't have to be miserable, well, that's okay with me. Still, we would have to wait. Another day, another chance. As soon as the weather cleared up, we were going to get back at it. And 2 days later, it was still pretty windy, only now it had changed. It was coming right straight out of the north. And by 5:30, we were already seeing deer up and feeding. There was a doe working her way through the acorns, followed by what appeared to be a pretty nice buck. They were working left to right on the other side of the food plot, so all we could really do was sit there and watch. And he followed her all the way out to the first opening, the first logging road, and then he stopped. And then he turned around and started coming back. I don't know why, he must have forgot his watch or something, but he was coming right straight back up the same trail. He made it all the way back, but he never did come out in front of us.
Talk to him. It works on me.
Yeah, well,
That's a pretty nice buck.
it is. It's raining.
Oh, sure it ain't snowing. I think it's snowing.
A half hour later, we could see 3 deer standing out in the food plot, and it was definitely raining and spitting snow. We also had a couple of deer right out in front of us, including one little guy right in our hip pocket. All we needed now was for these deer to lure some of those deer down to where Tina was set up. They were already well within range. Now all Tina needed was a shooter. Unfortunately, what she got was something else. This little gal worked her way up right alongside the blind, 2-3 feet, and then she just stood there picking and eating for what seemed like an eternity before she finally walked back out into the field without blowing up. Friends, believe me, drama does not always come attached to great big antlers, not on an archery hunt. On the other hand, when you're sitting there watching a couple of does and a great big set of antlers come strolling up the field, well, that can be pretty traumatic too.
Pillow. Oh, yeah. There's a nice buck. That's a shooter. Just gotta drag him over here.
There was a gorgeous 10-point working his way down the far side of the field, and the doe he seemed to be more or less following was actually turning and coming in. If this big boy followed her up in front of Tina,
Nice 10-point.
the doe had worked her way to within about 70 yards or so, but the big boy was just hanging back. He would stare in our direction and then stare off up the field. He was being ever so cautious, and I gotta say, big old deer don't get to be big or old if they're not. Still, we needed him to come in. The doe was working her way in. We just needed this buck to follow her in. She was almost there.
She's right.
Finally, after agonizing minutes, he had worked his way into about 40 yards, close enough for T to take a shot, only she couldn't because and there was no way to move the distance she needed to move to get her bow on that buck without blowing up this doe that stood there at less than 10 yards. And then she started coming closer. She stared us down for a bit and then turned and trotted off, and the big boy swapped ends, watched her as she moved off. And then so did he.
He's only about 40 yards.
And then, just as I was sure he was gone for good, he stopped, turned around, and actually started coming back. He took a few steps closer, stood there sniffing and staring. I thought, hey, maybe he could still see the girls farther down from us. They weren't very far out, maybe 35 or 40. I thought, he might just come back to them. And then again, maybe not. Talk about an emotional roller coaster. That big 10-point came so close, and he was a dandy. Tina sat there. I could hear her ragged breath. All she needed was just a little bit more. Unfortunately, as you saw, she didn't get it. That's archery hunting. It is different. If we'd have been sitting there with our Weatherby, our 270, Miss T and I'd have been loading something more than muddy boots into the big red truck that night. But we were archery hunting, and when you're archery hunting, yeah, sometimes you just have to keep hunting. By 5:30 the next afternoon, there were already deer all over the field feeding, including right out in front of Tina. This little buck, along with a couple of does, had worked its way in and across. And now we were just sitting there trying to be quiet, hoping that something would follow them in. I'd thrown a few crushed apples out in front of Tina, mostly to give the deer a reason to stop where we needed them to. It's a great tool wherever legal, and it can actually put the deer in the right position so that they're not staring at you while you try to maneuver to get your shot. Like everything else in deer hunting, it doesn't always work, but it's the same basic principle as when I make a mock scrape when I'm hunting down in the woods. It gets a deer to stop and face in the direction I want him to, and it can make all the difference when you're hunting with archery gear. What I hadn't planned on were the crows. I have never thrown out a couple of chunks of apples and then had crows show up and start fighting over them like they did right in front of Tina and I. These birds put up such a ruckus squabbling over who was going to get the 2 or 3 apple slices that they actually spooked the deer out of the field. When the crows left, so did the deer. It's like I said earlier, nothing always works, not on a deer hunt. I can honestly say that's the first time I've ever seen crows spook a group of deer. Still, we were fortunate in that less than a half hour later, they did start working their way back out into the food plot. Tina might get a chance yet. What appeared to be the same group of deer worked their way back out in front of us, followed by a couple of more youngsters. The deer were filling up the field again, and I was getting hopeful that maybe as it got darker, the older deer'd start showing up. But for the next hour, all we saw was the JV team. And then, just before dark, I heard Tina catch her breath. A dandy buck was working his way out into the field, and he was heading more or less in our direction. Already more than halfway across the field, if he kept following these other deer, kept working closer, another 50, 60 yards,
If I get a shot, yes.
He was finally there. Now it was on Tina.
Okay, shoot him. I think you missed.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know either. The deer be gone.
Yeah.
Poor Tina. We were so close. All it takes is just that little bit. It's the difference, like I've been saying all along, between an archery hunt and a rifle hunt. A couple of yards further out is nothing in a rifle hunt, but in an archery hunt, it can be everything. And if you ask Tina, I'm sure she'll tell you I told her the wrong distance, I whispered the wrong yardage to her in all the excitement. And be honest, I don't know, maybe I did. What I do know is that's why we archery hunt. It's that exciting. It's that intense. You have to do so many more things right just to get your chance. And when you finally do get your chance, it can still all go sideways at the very last minute. Hey, I want to congratulate Tina anyway. She did such a good job. She stuck it out. She got her chance. And we're certainly going to get back out there and try it again as soon as we can. Friends, if you haven't tried it yet, take up a bow, a stick bow, a crossbow, a compound bow. Go out and give that archery thing a try and take somebody with you. If my little grandma can go out there and archery hunt and enjoy it, well, your grandma, your grandson, granddaughter, whoever can too. It is a great time of year to be out, and it is a great way to challenge yourself in the deer woods. And who knows, if you do, we might just see you out there. And if that happens, well, you know we're going to stop and share that cup and a fire. And if we don't see you out there, friends, well, then I'll wait for you right back here so we can share another adventure from my Wilderness Journal.